who is our student representative at the Board of Education, will give her special welcome for the students.
On behalf of all the students at Berkeley High School, and particularly those of us who will be able to hear you today, I'd like to extend the warmest of welcomes. And in expression of our gratitude for your visit today, we'd like to give you this token of our appreciation.
Can you all hear me? Can you? Okay. Can you all see me? Anyway, I'm glad to be here. I don't have a lecture, and I really came to listen to you. I mean, I know about me, more or less. But to kick it off, it was suggested that I say some words about how I grew up. And that may be important because I'm beginning to realize that, well, I knew it, but I'm beginning to realize it all over again, that really the world in which I grew up, for someone your age, must seem almost biblical in its distance, and in any case was a very different world. I was born in 1924 in Harlem Hospital. My father was a preacher from New Orleans. My mother was a girl from Maryland. I'm sorry. And I'm the oldest of 9 children. When I was growing up, the world was bounded by what I knew of Harlem. Later on, when I started to work, not very much later on, when I went downtown, I could see the difference between my father's house, my mother's kitchen, and the places where I worked. I could see, therefore, what I'm saying is what white Americans thought not only of me, but thought of my mother and my father, my brothers and my sisters. And we were told when I was growing up that we had no past and never contributed anything to civilization, and that Africa was a rather damp and dangerous continent. We were lucky to have been saved from it, where we would have been cannibals if we'd stayed. This all seemed very strange to me, because my father did not agree with that at all. My father was a very religious man. He was also a very, very, very bitter and proud man. And what white Christians said to me had nothing whatever to do with how my father came home from work, trembling with rage, dangerous with rage, dangerous with pain. And I was too young to realize what a black cat's working day was like until, of course, my working day began. And I would come home wanting to murder somebody. And it's very, very dangerous because it turns against you and you really want to murder yourself. And what you're reacting to on many, many levels is the white world's estimate of you and the limbo in which they place you, or placed me then, because if you have no past, then clearly you have no future. And then to try to deal with white boys and girls in school, in the streets, became a very, very, very difficult matter because I didn't hate them. I hated the cops. I hated the landlords. I hated some of my teachers. But it was difficult, and I fought with a lot of boys my age, but that's not the same thing as hating them. Well, time passes. In one way or another, you get through somehow what you have to get through. In some ways, I was glad because all the children for whom I had to be responsible was my father died so soon. Eventually, I went to Paris to prevent myself from being murdered or committing murder, and to finish my first book. So I could prove to my brothers and sisters that at least I was trying to get something done. Because you got to remember too, that where I was born, when I was born, the idea of being a black writer had never entered anybody's head. And as far as I knew then, there'd never been a black writer in the entire history of the world. I discovered different things, different libraries, finally in different countries. And in a way, when I left this country 30 years ago, I was able to see it for the first time. I was able to forgive it for the first time. And I was able to understand something very, very difficult to explain, but my relationship with the English language altered when I was in France because I was living in a kind of silence. And in that silence, I didn't speak any French and didn't know anybody. In that silence, I began to hear the language which had really produced me. That is to say, every black writer, on one level or another, is forced to have a quarrel with the English language, with the assumptions of the English language. My father, for example, did not exist in Shakespeare's English. Neither did my mother. Neither, for that matter, did I. But I knew that my father was not black-hearted, and I knew that my mother was not as black as sin. I knew that white was not the color of virtue, it might be the color of death. And I began to hear my father's voice in that silence, and the music which produced me, and the blues, and the gospel, and the spirituals, and the beat of black speech. As black people speak in a cadence. It's a very particular, very special thing which exists nowhere else as far as I know in the world. And part of that is because black people have always had to say something. I've had to say to my brother, for example, actually and historically, while the captain or the cop is listening, I got to say something to my brother, which my brother understands and the cop don't. And that's one of the ways the language which black people speak was formed, and it's one of the things that formed us. It is a mystery, however, and this is a sad thing to have to say, but the language which I'm talking about, so what am I talking about, is a black experience in this country. It's still a mystery and a threat for most of the people in this country who think of themselves as white. I suggest, by the way, I think the whole vocabulary has got to be overhauled. But I think it might be useful for white people and for black people to think of it this way. I think white people are an invention. And they were invented in America. They were not white in Russia, or in Italy, or in Greece, or in France, or in England. They got on boats and came across the ocean, and for the first time, they became white. They became white here because I was here. And therefore I had to be black. I had to be black in order to justify the crimes being committed against me. Now, that's a very heavy inheritance if you're black. It's a very, very heavy inheritance if you're white. And since we are in this country together, and not a single man or woman in this country can prove he or she is right. We've been here together so long that we're going to have to learn how to live with each other. Now, it is your generation, much more than my own, on whom this burden falls. You are the generation to whom the world belongs, to whom the future belongs. This century has 20 years to go, and some of you will be approaching 30 at that time, and some of you will not be past 40. And in the very same way that the world in which I was born is unimaginable for any of you. Now, what is coming when you will be the actors on the stage is unimaginable now, but it is something that you will have to bring about. The world is not white. The slave trade is going to end. The economic undergirding of the Western world has always been slave labor, and the Western world is in a crisis because it is losing its slaves. There's a new personality being evolved on the African continent with which future generations will have to deal, you first of all, and the bridge between Africa and us has to be established by your generation, and a new generation will come out of you, which may begin, after all, which may be the beginning of the new world we've been trying to establish for so long. And I'm not a pessimist. I believe that the people who have endured what we have endured for so long have nothing whatever to be afraid of, and I count on you. That's all I have to say.
Okay, so we'll field your questions, whatever you have. Gentleman over there.
Could you talk briefly about the relationship between the poison and the antidote in terms of being the sun?
I'm sorry. The gentleman, the boy, asked me if I would discuss the question of the antidote and the poison, which comes from notes of a native son. And the poison was, I was speaking about the poison of rage, of self-hatred.